Hello everybody and welcome to another Fire Emblem video here on the channel. Today we're going to be doing not a top 5 list. We are going to be looking at 5 characters because I figured it was a good number, I guess, for this. But these are not the top 5 most surprisingly great units in all of Fire Emblem. I always have kind of a hard time doing these lists that are very open-ended and include all of Fire Emblem because past like Shadow Dragon, I'm not super familiar with what's good and what's not. I have played all the games, but not as extensively as the earlier games. So these are just 5 units from the games I'm familiar with that I think are surprisingly great. So as always with these lists, this one in particular is going to be extremely subjective. So if you agree, if you don't agree, either way, please feel free to comment down below who you think is surprisingly great. I love to hear. One of my favorite things about these videos is hearing what other people think about characters. Probably a ton I missed. This is also something that we could revisit in the future because again, this is not a top 5 list. It's just 5 units that I think are surprisingly great. As far as the idea for the video, it's basically the inverse of the last video we looked at, which was disappointing units. These are units that, because of like class or stats or base level, something along those lines, you think are just going to be mediocre or not going to be that great, but wind up being extremely good, right? So that's kind of the idea for the list. And as you can see, as I said, we do have all 5 of the characters we're going to be talking about right here. So just before we start the video, if you enjoy the content, if you like this sort of content, please consider subscribing. It really helps me out and lets me know what people are enjoying here on the channel, and commenting. I already mentioned commenting, but love to hear what you guys think about these things. So yeah, we'll talk about them individually. One more thing before we start: this is not a list, as I've said a bunch of times. So this is going to be in no particular order. We're just going to kind of go through them. So let's get started with that. Alright, so starting off our list, I have Oathan, or Oathan, or I'm not really sure. I've played a couple different translation patches of Thracia over the years, and I always thought it was Oathan, but when I looked it up, it said Oathan. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to say Oathan for the purposes of this list, even though I have something else up there, but because that's just kind of how I know it. In any case, Oathan is one of 2 fighters that's recruited at the very beginning of Thracia. You get him on the first chapter. His availability is solid. Obviously, getting on the first chapter is, quite good. And then he's re-recruited after the Mancer escape, where you lose most of your characters fairly early in the game after that. So quite strong as far as availability is concerned. He comes with another fighter in Halvin, who's fairly similar to him, and yet Halvin is a pretty mediocre character in the game, and Oathan is one of the very best characters in the game. So the reason I have him on this list is because if you look at early fighters in, let's say, the GBA games, they're almost always really mediocre. You have like Dorcas, Bartry, Lot, Wade. They're fine units, and so is Oathan and Halvin, but they're not anything special. But the thing about Thracia is that there are, number one, there's skills in the game, and there's a lot of signature weapons, and both these things can really propel a unit into being really fantastic. It's really hard to be a decent unit in this game if you don't have one of these things, some kind of signature weapon, some kind of good skill, some kind of like staff utility, right? Just stats don't do it. And Oathan very much accomplishes these. So there's 2 reasons that makes Oathan so fantastic and sets him apart from Halvin. And it's really good, a really good sort of way to look at how good he is compared to Halvin. So in the first chapter, both him and Halvin have specific houses that they can visit, and they get special axes. Halvin's is a brave axe that anyone can use once they get to be in axes. Now Halvin starts B, which is kind of cool, but anyone can use it in the end. Oathan, on the other hand, gets the I think it's like the Puji, something like that. I could be butchering that, but it's his own personal axe. It has 2 range, it has a ton of attack, it has 50 uses, just like all the personal weapons in the game. It's extremely strong. So right off the bat, Oathan gets sort of some combat utility that nobody else can get because nobody else can use the Puji. Along with that, he has Wrath, and Wrath in Thracia is really strong because it means that you get to automatically crit on all counter attacks. So that, in conjunction with the Puji, which has 2 range, as I said, and a lot of attack, basically means that if you just sit there and let enemies attack him, he can absolutely destroy huge swaths of enemies. So he's incredibly strong in the game. And again, if you just look at him and don't fully understand like the Puji and Wrath and stuff like that, he may just look like a generic character. And basically he is in the form of Halvin, but he has those things which really propel him into being, again, one of the best characters in Thracia. Alright, so next up on our list, I have a unit that is actually very similar to the previous unit, to Oathan. He's from the same game, he's from Thracia, and that is Asbell. So Asbell is a mage that you get during the Mancer escape portion of the game. He immediately comes with fairly weak stats, but it's pretty easy to get magic during that portion of the game because Lifis can steal it from a lot of the mages, which is really nice for him. Magic is quite good in the game. It hits pretty hard, and Asbell has a really high speed stat and speed growth, so he can start doubling really quickly. But what makes Asbell so good, and this is, again, fairly similar to Oathan, and I mentioned that personal weapons in Thracia are extremely strong, Asbell comes with Graph Caliber, and Graph Caliber has to be one of the strongest weapons in the entire game. It's absolutely insane, and it turns Asbell from sort of an early, probably pretty decent mage to one of the best combat characters in the entire game, right up there with Oathan, probably better. You know, if you look at a lot of the mages, again, I'm going to go to the GBA games, but this works for a lot of games like, you know, Lu or Archer or Urk, what have you. You know, these are pretty solid units. I think Lu's probably the best of those. Archer's pretty good. In any case, they're not necessarily like the best units in the entire game, but they are really solid units. And Asbell may seem like one of those. So I wouldn't say that he's like necessarily that surprisingly good, but I think he is surprising to be like one of the best characters in the entire game, which he very much is, just because again, Graph Caliber is so powerful. And again, he has good stats other than that. He has like staff utility when he promotes, even just using normal tomes and stuff. You know, his speed is really good. Even though his magic, you know, struggles maybe a bit, but yeah, Graph Caliber is just so powerful and really makes him one of the very best characters in Thracia. And next up on our list, I have Mia, specifically Radiant Dawn Mia, not Path of Radiance Mia, because she's terrible in Path of Radiance. We don't want to talk about her in Path of Radiance. But in Radiant Dawn, Mia is actually surprisingly really good. Now, Mia is not one of the very best characters in the entire game like Asbell or Oathan are, but it is very surprising that she is as good as she is. And she is solid. It's just hard to be like one of the best characters in the game when you have characters like Har running around. But Mia shows up and is recruited with the Mercenaries, which is really beneficial to her on the one hand because it means her availability is really solid. That's a big portion of the game. But it also is kind of a negative because there's a lot of really good units on the Mercenaries between like Ike, Titania, Shinan, Gatry, just a bunch of really solid units. But Mia actually still kind of stands out. She's basically the only unit that isn't Shinan that can actually double right off the bat, which is pretty strong and actually gives her pretty solid combat. Her really high speed that would in, let's say, Path of Radiance not be that useful is really useful because, again, doubling is really hard, gives her really good avoid. The biorhythm effects of Radiant Dawn make like dodge tanking fairly difficult, but Mia has so much speed and luck that she can actually do it pretty consistently. And even if you do happen to get hit by something, her HP and defense are also pretty solid. Once you get her to her True Blade, she is really, really strong. And her strength is not bad either, so that in conjunction with the speed means that her offensive output is really solid. Again, she's not one of the best characters in the entire game, but she is really, really good, and it's just surprising considering, again, how bad she is in Path of Radiance and how weird it seems that a Myrmidon would be good in Radiant Dawn. You could look at like Edward, and it's not like Myrmidons are suddenly amazing. I mean, Zahark is, but he's kind of his own thing, right? He just has pretty good stats. It's not like the class got way better. It's just that Mia's pretty darn good. She's got good enough stats to stand out in the Mercenaries. Next up on our list, I have Rucker, who's fairly similar to the previous mention on this list in Mia, mostly in the sense that he's the same class, which again is surprising, mostly just because that class is historically very bad. It's really bad in the GBA games, it's really bad in Thracia, Path of Radiance. There are obviously games where it's a little bit better, for example, Fire Emblem 6, but most of the games sort of surrounding Fire Emblem 6, it's quite bad. I would say that Rucker is sort of a universally like beloved character. Most people that I talk to understand that he's really good, and he most certainly is. But if you look at him sort of contextually through the other games, specifically the GBA games, it is really surprising that he's so strong. Because if you look at like Guy and Joshua, who are basically just the same as him, they're recruited pretty much at the same times in their games. They have very similar stats, maybe slightly lower. So all the stuff would point you to believe that they're all the same character. So why are Guy and Joshua pretty mediocre to pretty bad in their respective games when Rucker is so good? I actually have a video where I sort of break this down and talk about in more detail why he's so much better. But I would say the cliff notes are just swords are much better. Two range isn't as good. The hit rates of swords are really useful. Rucker's really good at killing bosses, which normally you'd have to worry about, but bosses are pretty tough in Fire Emblem 6. And hit rates are really bad, so Rucker's really good at that. And also the really high speed of Swordmasters isn't as wasteful as it is in a lot of the other games. It's just hard to double stuff in Fire Emblem 6. The stats are really high, so Rucker's really good for that. So there are some contextual reasons that he's so good in Fire Emblem 6. But if you were just looking at other games, especially the other GBA games, and then went and played Fire Emblem 6, you probably would just discard Rucker and not think twice about it. But again, just because of Fire Emblem 6 being sort of a unique case, Rucker winds up being one of the very best characters in the entire game, whereas again, Guy and Joshua are quite bad in their games. So Rucker is, to me, pretty surprising if we're looking at the other GBA games, or even just the other Fire Emblem games around this time. And finally, running out our list, I have Harkin for Fire Emblem 7. So Harkin is a hero that you get fairly late in the game, but he does get hard mode bonuses, which makes him really strong. Now, Harkin is maybe surprising to be on this surprising list because it's pretty clear right off the bat that Harkin will be a really solid unit for you. But that's just it. I think it's pretty clear that Harkin is a solid unit. He's got solid stats across the board. He's bulky. He's got good weapon ranks. He's got really good strength, but his speed looks maybe a little bit shaky. What surprises me about Harkin is just how good that he winds up being, right? Because at that stage in the game, you're pretty late in Fire Emblem 7. And while Harkin's stats, again, look good, especially his speed stat looks like, you know, he might be able to inflict some decent damage, take some hits well, but that's kind of it. But Fire Emblem 7, enemy stats just don't get that high. He does still sort of need a Speedwing to really be busted. Speedwing boots, especially Barrier Harkin, can just destroy the endgame, but he can pretty much destroy the endgame with or without the Speedwing. And I think that's what surprises me the most about him. He looks like he's going to be a solid tempo unit at the end of the game that'll sort of make his way into your team and be a nice, reliable unit. But he winds up being this super busted unit that can just absolutely destroy the endgame. So maybe he's only surprising to me in that respect, but it is just interesting that he's so good. You know, if you look at a character like Pen isn't surprising to me in Fire Emblem 7 because his stats are so high, he's recruited earlier, he's a good class, all that stuff. Harkin is a little more surprising, which is why I have him on this list. So that is the end of the list here today. Again, if you agree with me, if you don't agree with me, feel free to comment down below. I'm always curious to see, you know, what people have to say. And if you have characters that you were disappointed in, feel free to put them down below as well. I'm very interested in that. But yeah, that is the end of the video. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, everybody.